Welcome to this ASMR edition of Tales from Outer Space, where we like to take stories from space from around the internet and read it aloud for your entertainment. Psych, that's not happening. We're doing this with energy. With energy, I'm telling you. Subscribe, damn it, and all that other YouTube stuff. All the links will be down below, as per usual. And as always, I hope that you enjoy. I'd quickly like to thank the following Tier 5 patrons and channel members for supporting the channel. Datamagnet and Bob the Dragon. Thank you very much. Story number 1. Wartime Economy, written by a lone donut. The Orion Arm Treaty has less of a unified government and more of an agreement to keep being nice to one another. Roughly 6 parsecs across and little under 20 species occupied the space. For the most part, were peaceful. Small squabbles would occasionally break out in the treaty, a border skirmish here, a bit of sponsored piracy there. But in the long run, the various nations of the OAT were fairly amicable. Free movement of species to work with one another and to live on others' planets meant that over time, cultural exchanges popped up. Military training exercises happened together. Trade was, for the most part, open and free, and the collective agreement to keep peace held well. Humans were the odd ones out in the collection. While they were overall fairly aligned, they seemed to be made up of micronations, smaller nations that operated slightly different from one another. This didn't really result in any changes to the overall operation and connectivity of humans to the larger whole, but the bureaucracy made them slower to react. This seemed like the humans' greatest weakness. Their inability to make timely and effective decisions often had them responding late to challenges, or simply not able to deal with trade disputes effectively. For the most part, even with their full star systems, they were considered fairly backwater, and were only ever a minor player in the politics of the OAT. That was until the conflict arose. And not a minor conflict many were familiar with, no. This was something external. In the grand scheme of things, 6-ish parsecs is not a lot of territory, and exploration had been slowly expanding it. But with many asteroid belts rich with minerals, the need for rapid expansion had simply never existed. Production always managed to outpace need, so there were no calls for rapid expansion. The Squalor Empire changed that. A chance meeting on a system being surveyed meant that a Trillard survey ship came across the Squalor science ship. The two exchanged handshakes, and a brief dialogue was opened, with a report sent back of the discovery of a new species to the Trillard government. Soon after, the survey ship went dark. It was suspected something had happened, so a pair of patrol ships had been dispatched, only to find the wreckage of the survey ship. Its black box made it rather apparent what had happened, with the Squalor ship being greatly offended that a collection of species existed outside the Empire, and destroyed the ship. Some light espionage later, and the OA team had a fair idea of the nearby neighbors. The Squalor themselves had been an early spacefaring race, reaching the stars before most of their solar neighbors. Upon realizing there were other sentient species around them, they decided that it was the rightful place to rule, and had begun subjugating any species around them that showed signs of being able to reach space one day. A Class II system was created, and an empire was born. The idea repulsed the members of the Orion Arm Treaty. The idea of one species over another seemed terrifying. The Squalor were repulsed for their own reasons, that there were species treating others as equals, and the thought of their empire could be threatened by those drove them to a natural conclusion. They had to eradicate the treaty and subjugate them to prove their own strength. The war started with the Trillard world being besieged, bombarded from orbit for days on end until any military resistance fell. This spelled trouble for the treaty, who had, up until this point, only ever had fear each other turning. Now the need for rapid military movement was needed, and all sections were called on for support. The treaty became a coalition, and all nations were called upon to support how they could.
the Coalition called on humanity and its steady mining operations to simply direct resources to other shipyards, fearing the inefficiency would spell doom in the conflict if they needed to focus on shipbuilding agreements. But this request was denied. Something had changed in the humans, and at first it was feared that they had turned coward and were only going to protect themselves. As resources stopped leaving the human borders, there was panic. It was when the human ships started to arrive on the front lines that things began to really get confusing. At first, they were little more than refitted and retrofitted ships, the odd patrol craft with bigger weapons and more weapons, paired with freighters and civilian ships turned to combat vessels. These ships would show up in space conflicts, hit their opponents hard, and turn and run. At first, this tactic was majorly effective, breaking Squalor concentration of more serious targets to address the threat. This would let the Coalition forces push back against the Empire and make ground. The next set of ships to arrive were more confusing, as cruisers, destroyers, and frigates arrived, joining the Coalition forces and flanking maneuvers, slamming against the side of the Imperial fleets and dishing out far more damage than they were taking. Human Marines were landing on planets and joining combat zones hot and hard, with armor and weapons none of the Coalition had seen before. And once the first human battleships joined the fray, the Coalition began to grow concerned. However, there wasn't time to dwell, as the conflict raged on, and they needed to push back. When the first Trillard world taken was reclaimed, the Empire sued for peace, but the humans denied them. It was like a spark on the underbrush of a forest that had long been quiet and peaceful. A fire had been lit, and now it was out of control. The Coalition fleet became more and more human-dominated by the day, but the humans didn't have enough soldiers and sailors, so they began to equip their friends. A steady outpouring of ships from their 4 little systems they had reached fits of crescendo, and still the humans were unhappy. Engineers were sent to allies, their facilities retrofitted to fit the production needs of the human Goliath, and so more ships could be made. Other engineers were taught how to build, schematics and plans shared, and the crescendo grew once more as the voices were added. Soon, it felt like the entire Coalition was working at 200% what they could have before, as their fleets swelled, a massive beast that couldn't be slowed anymore. Human boots were the first to touch down outside the Empire quarters on Squalor homeworld, and human fingers instructed the Empire where to sign, and how they would go about rebuilding and repaying the peoples that had subjugated all these years. The humans defanged the beast, put its leaders in a cage, and made it a workhorse of its own destruction. As the war effort wound down and the humanitarian effort slowly turned over to other parties, the humans grew quiet. In all their conquests, they had been gifted 6 new star systems, more than doubling the size of their territory. And with that, they turned back to arguing with themselves. The debate over how to populate these systems and how to develop them, consuming their little corner of the galaxy. And after 5 years, it was like it had never happened. And once again the humans faded into the background, a minor player in a larger world. Diplomats were asked once about the whole affair, and they'd simply laughed it off, saying no one had to worry about it. It was the phrasing, though, that made many species write down and remember for many years to come. Oh, that was just a wartime economy. End of story. Story number 2. I met the human 3 times. Written by Dicemonger. I met the humans 3 times. The first, I was but a child, and so was he. While exploring the gardens of the White Palace, I met him in one of the elaborate hedge mazes, and with the ignorance of youth thought nothing of the difference in race. We played hide-and-seek for what must have been hours, and he shared the food he had brought, which I found strange and unsubtly flavored, but filling beyond any I had experienced. When his father found us, he begged my forgiveness and asked that I please keep the afternoon a secret. I was young, but I gave my promise, and I kept it. I visited the maze again at a later day, but the human boy was not there. When my father left the palace for his posting in the outer world, where time runs faster than at a royal seat, I left with him, and it was decades before I returned. The second time I met him, I was nearly of age, but still young enough to make juvenile mistakes. I was again exploring the endless gardens of the palace, while balancing on a knife's edge of the black pool. I lost my balance and fell in. At that point, I had not yet learnt to swim, as my tutors had thought the subjects of history, magic, sword lessons, and many others to be greater importance. As my water-laden clothes dragged me towards the bottom, I could only reflect on the absurdity of an immortal life ended so early in such a foul manner. And then he was there, grabbing me, swimming to the surface, dragging me from the water. For but a moment, I took in his middle-aged face, the water running from the gardener's attire and his sputtering breaths. Then we were surrounded by people, helping me to my feet and hauling the human away. Laying a hand on the member of a superior caste, as all owls are to humans, and notably even more so, should have cost him his life. But because he had saved my life, his sentence was reduced to 30 lashes and banishment to the outer world. I tried to argue against the sentence, against any punishment, but I was patiently explained that the laws existed for a purpose, that the sentence was a mercy compared to what many argued would have been justice. The third time I met him, I lay defeated, as the rebel army pursued and defeated forces of the White Queen from the field. My leg was broken, and I could only watch as the humans went amongst those laying on the ground, laboring to save those with rounded ears, and putting a sword through those with ears that were pointed. A man loomed over me, and I accepted my fate. But then a hand fell upon the man's arm, stopping him, and the rebel leader stepped forward. It was but a few decades after I met him the second time, but life in the outer world runs faster, and in terms of human lifespans, he was near the end of his life. He looked down at me, and I will not deny that I was fearful as I looked up at him. But then he pulled the other away and said, "Not this one. This one is different." And that, my brothers, are why I am now amongst you. To be honest, I don't even know for a fact that these 3 humans were the same one, though I believe they were. And if one human can possess the open-mindedness, selfless compassion, and forgiveness that this human portrayed, then I believe that we as a race can do so as well. We consider ourselves the superior race. In terms of military might and magical prowess, we might have been correct. But in terms of what really matters, in terms of the spiritual worth and purity of purpose, I believe that humans are who we should aspire to be. And I hope that you will join me in making that happen. End of story. And that, my friends, concludes this video. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you do, please consider supporting the author, even by popping over and leaving a thumbs up or a nice comment, just to show your appreciation for the story. However, if you wish to support this channel, there are links down below which will help immensely. I will see you all in the next one, and until then, I hope that you have a fantastic day. Cheers.